So, two really great booktubers, Kieran at KDBooks and Brandon at Brandon's Bookshelf, both recently put out videos listing must-read classic books, classic works that are so eminent and valuable that you just need to read them. And I thought, being the contrarian that I am, I could jump in there and do a video coming at it from a different angle, the opposite direction, and say some classic books that you should not read, because I have read a fair amount of books in my day, a lot of them what we would consider classic works. And I'm here to tell you, if nobody else will, that not all of them are nearly as valuable as you may be led to believe. So, with this video, I hope to highlight 5 books that are considered, however tenuously, classics that I think you don't have to read and that you should probably avoid for one reason or another. Now, disclaimer, some of these books I actually have not read in their entirety myself. I could not get through them because they were, for whatever reason, so bad, so egregious that the reading of them I just could not endure. But I think, if anything, that only serves to back up the entire theme of this video a little bit better. So join me, won't you, as I list 5 classic books that you don't need to read and that you probably should avoid, or I would if I were you. And to denote what I mean by the word classic, I'm just using that to mean any book written before 1900, because we'll just call that the cutoff for the modern era. So here we go. Number 5, Ben-Hur. So this is possibly the quintessential Christian novel. And it is ironically one of the very few books that has ever managed to outsell the Bible, not in aggregate, but over a certain period of time. It is the basis as well for more than one film, the most famous perhaps being the 1950s Charlton Heston epic. And if ever there was an example of a film which surpassed its source material, this is it, because Ben-Hur, the book, is unfreaking readable. As I said at the beginning, I did not even complete reading some of these books, and this is one that I didn't, because the reading of this book I simply could not endure. The writing is the driest, most uninspired, and mechanical that I think I've ever encountered. Every last minute detail is recorded with all the enthusiasm of a shopping list, and it is unbelievably unengaging to read. So much so that I abandoned it. I will probably never finish reading Ben-Hur, and you know what? I do not count that a great loss. I remember distinctly there was a scene in this book where 2 men are meeting in the desert and they're riding camels, and you better believe that those camels are described in excruciating detail, as well as the apparatuses in which the men ride, those canopied saddle things. And when they dismount off the camel, you better believe that it tells us in great detail how they get down off the camel. And then it goes on to describe how they give each other a hug in greeting. And there's like 3 paragraphs describing how they put their arms out at 45 degrees from their body, and then they lean in at 0.2 miles per hour, and then they gently clasp each other, and then they pat each other on the back. And I was like, hell no, this is unfreaking readable, like I said. And yeah, not going back to Ben-Hur, at least not anytime soon. This book is very influential, though. As I said, it may be the quintessential Christian novel, and probably one of the first Christian novels, one of the first books that's written with the express intent of conversion. The story is the tale of a Roman soldier who is betrayed and who subsequently finds himself following the teachings of Jesus Christ. It's set in that contemporary era. And, that's all good, but, is it too much to ask that it at least be interesting? So it baffles me how this book moved as many copies as it did. I guess just because it's, 150 or whatever years old, and there wasn't as much competition back then, because this book would move jack shit today, because it is a crap book, and you would do well to avoid it. If you want to experience the story of Ben-Hur, just watch the Charlton Heston movie, and you ain't missing anything by not reading the book. Number 4, Titus Andronicus by William Shakespeare. I include this because in Brandon's video that he did, he included one of the works that you should read. Is the complete works of William Shakespeare. I wholeheartedly agree that Shakespeare needs to be on any must-read list, but I would never assert that the complete works of William Shakespeare need to be read because that would include this, and this is some crap. So this play, I probably don't even need to introduce it. It's scorned and reviled. There's been kind of a very subdued reevaluation of it, but even the apologists for this play aren't that vocal. Like, there's an argument that you can make that maybe this was intended as a satire rather than a genuine story. But even if that's so, it still fails miserably as drama. There is no emotional connection to any of the characters because there aren't any grand sweeping soliloquies like you expect out of a Shakespeare play. It doesn't really say anything about human nature or the human condition. It's more akin to watching like a Saw movie. You're entertained. It is entertaining, but you're entertained just because you kind of want to see how far it will go, and it goes very, very far. But at the end of the day, it's a base, ignoble kind of work, not any real artistic achievement, and it's pretty clear this was Shakespeare's early years because it's just not that good. There's nothing remarkable about it except its depravity, and it has depravity in spades, and that's why it really probably hasn't. It doesn't probably resound all that well with modern audiences because it can be kind of offensive. It uses some things like violence against women, has a gang rape, off stage gang rape thing, and then some mutilation that it uses is just plot points to some really cheap kind of plot points to just move this violent, sordid tale onwards. And it's just not really any good. I would recommend this only to Shakespeare completionists. I only have this myself because I saw it for like a quarter at a library sale. And yeah, so don't read Titus Andronicus unless you just are infatuated with Shakespeare because there's really nothing to get out of it. Go with Hamlet, go with Macbeth, but don't go with this. Number 3, In a Glass Darkly by Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu. I think this was the first book that I read this year in 2022, and it was not that good. If you are not familiar with this work, this is not a novel, but rather a collection of very, very tenuously linked short stories, which are considered classics of the horror genre. These were individual stories involving the macabre and or supernatural that were then retroactively tied together rather haphazardly, I might add, with kind of a frame story set at the beginning of the book, which presents these stories as being from the case files of a certain paranormal investigator whose name eludes me at the moment. That should let you know how much of an impact this book actually made. But there is only one story from this collection that is actually worth reading, and that is Carmilla. If you are not familiar with Carmilla, that is the story that introduced that tried and true trope of the lesbian vampire. It is a vampire story replete with all the classic elements: creepy gothic castle, dangerous, seductive woman, albeit this time with a decidedly more Sapphic bent. And that story is actually really good, very atmospheric. But all the rest of the stories in this collection range from meh to all out garbage. So that one story, Carmilla, is the only one that I can recommend. And thankfully, you can read that and even purchase that story, which is actually it's not a short story. That's actually a novella, but you can read and or purchase that separately from the rest of this collection, and that's what I would recommend you do because again, this collection overall ain't that great, but Carmilla is. I mean, it's also surprisingly kind of progressive, just a wee bit, I guess, because usually stories of that era involving homosexual themes were either very veiled or condemnatory. And this one's not really, or at least not as much as you would expect it to be. It's definitely leans heavily into it, but it's not quite as censorious as you might expect it to be. And it's, as I said, very atmospheric and pretty effective. So yeah, I can definitely recommend Carmilla, but as for the rest of the stories in this collection, pass them by. And speaking of vampires, that brings us to number two, Dracula by Bram Stoker. This is another one that I never completed reading because Dracula freaking sucks, pun intended. This is the quintessential vampire novel, and wow, was it underwhelming, or at least it was to me. Not only because of how boring it is, but also because of its repugnant subtext. So, this is an epistolary novel, and man oh man, does that format really not serve this story well. It does in the beginning, the early pages of this book, the kind of prologue section where Jonathan Harker is actually in Dracula's castle being sexually menaced by the brides of Dracula. That section was very effective and very well done. They even eat a baby. I was kind of caught off guard by how gruesome it got with the vampires actually eating a baby. That was unexpected. But once the story proper kind of commences, when it jumps back to England, it quickly falls apart. And as I said, the epistolary format does not do this story very good service because the action of this story feels so removed from the immediate. The epistolary style of writing does not lend itself well to, as I said, immediacy. The action that the story describes feels so removed and distant that it's not very visceral and it's not very exciting. And it subsequently is boring to read, or at least it was to me. And to speak on the repugnant subtext of this book, one thing that I think a lot of people apparently don't pick up on in this book is that this book really isn't about vampires. What it really is about is a thinly veiled misogynistic screed about how women are feeble and stupid and have to be kept subjugated and in their proper place in society. It embodies basically every sexual paranoia that the Victorian era had to offer, and it has aged like absolute milk in that regard. Van Helsing is constantly making comments towards the female characters like she has the mind of a man. She can actually think and reason just like a man. And so many books from this era embody, creaky sort of beliefs, but very few books are geared entirely around those beliefs. The reason why the myth of the vampire, is so often mixed with themes of sexuality and sexual dominance and whatever, is because largely of this book, because this book uses the vampire as kind of a motif to explore sexual mores and the proper place of women and men in society. And yeah, it's kind of a douchey read. Bram Stoker was a douchebag, I guess, by modern standards, because this is not a progressive book in the slightest. And I think I read like a third or maybe a half of it, and I just gave up. It was boring. Dracula never freaking showed up until he never showed up when I was reading it. After that first section, it's just a bunch of people talking about Dracula, but no real Dracula in the story. And so I just quit on it, and I'll probably never read the rest of it. And I don't think you should either, because Dracula is a hella overrated book, and it's a classic that you can pass right on by. And the number one classic book that you should not read, or that I would not read if I were you, is War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy. I never pass up an opportunity to shit on this book because this was the biggest waste of time I have ever had reading a book. It took me 6 months to read War and Peace. That is the longest it has ever taken me to read a book. Now, granted, I was in college when I was reading it, so I didn't really have all the time to devote to it, or I would have probably knocked it out in a much shorter span. But as it stands, it took me 6 months to read it, and I got absolutely nothing out of it. And I think this book is the single most overrated book in the history of books, and I'm going to tell you why. So if you don't know what War and Peace is about, if you are one of those fortunates who have never read it, War and Peace is at its heart an attack, a 1,400-page attack on a now thoroughly exploded historical theory called the Great Man Theory that was held in antiquity, which stated that the motions of history and the movements of the world were determined by the decisions of a select few great men like Alexander and Napoleon. And Napoleon is the primary antagonist of this book. This book is concerned with the Napoleonic Wars in Europe and Napoleon's thwarted foray into Russia. If you're not familiar with that bit of history, Napoleon was a conqueror who was tearing it up in Europe. He was kind of set to become a new Alexander, and he had conquered a lot of ground, but he met his match in Russia, and that was where the line was drawn. And what this book ends up being is thoroughly hypocritical and contradictory to its own central theme. So Tolstoy spends 1,400 pages unsubtly and heavy-handedly hammering home that the great man theory of history is bunk, and that the motions of the world are determined not by the decisions of a select few, but by everybody, that everybody contributes to the movements of history, because the great men are only ever the products of their circumstances and environment, and subsequently that great men don't really exist, or at least not in the way that they were taken to have existed back then, and that Napoleon really isn't that impressive. However, this book is simultaneously and paradoxically a 1,400-page panegyric to Russian nationalism, and it extols and praises the Russians for being able to halt Napoleon's advance. But as I said, that is entirely contradictory to its main thrust, which is great men don't exist and that theory is bunk. So why are you painting this so heroically if you don't even believe that Napoleon was that great? It's just at odds with itself. And also, it's very petty and shallow in its portrayal of Napoleon. Tolstoy obviously detested Napoleon, and the way he goes out of his way to portray him as just kind of an idiot and a bumbling stooge, it's just very, again, petty and kind of the mark of a very small writer, I think. But also, this book is attempts, at least, to be a work of philosophy that is not very well integrated with the story it tells, and that is a real weakness of War and Peace that I don't think anybody else really brings up. I think everybody else kind of just glosses over that, and that is the awkwardness with which this book is written. So I think that a good writer, and I will use Dostoevsky, a much better Russian novelist, as an example, a good writer should be able to seamlessly integrate their themes and their narrative in such a way that is cohesive. Tolstoy does not do that here. His philosophical musings, which I'm going to put that in quotes because I think they're really not that deep and they don't really have much to offer nowadays, I don't think, because again, the main theory that he is attacking here is just it's common knowledge that that's not true. But his philosophical musings are so awkwardly shoehorned in here that he literally just stops the story at certain points and goes off on tangents and writes what amount to essays basically on whatever topic he happened to cross his mind that he wanted to expound upon. And so this book is just kind of this weird, broken experience where you'll get narrative, characters, and story, and then it just an essay. I didn't like that. I thought it was clumsy, awkward, and not very adept. And as to the characters in this book, people will tell you that this book has hundreds of characters, and it does, but the main characters of the book are really only a handful. And oh my word, I have never hated a cast of characters in a book like I did with War and Peace. These characters in this book are so whiny and insufferable, I wanted all of them to die by the end of the book. They are all fabulously wealthy and have absolutely nothing to complain about, but complain they do to excess. And by the end of this book, I had had enough of it. And also, Tolstoy's character just shows through so blatantly in this book. And if you don't know, I just detest Tolstoy. I think he was a massive hypocrite. The man who preached a gospel of abstinence and piety had 15 children and owned several hundred serfs, and he never gave any of that up, even when he took up his soapbox and started trying to tell everybody else how to live their lives. I don't like Tolstoy. That's not why I don't like this book, or at least not in full. I don't like this book because this book is boring AF, and it just goes on and on and on, and so little actually happens. The characters are pretty well developed, I'll give it that, but what it ultimately does just isn't that great, I don't think. I didn't get anything out of it. It did not reveal to me anything which I had not already been exposed to or that I did not already know. And so I just don't get what people get out of reading this. I've seen so many reviews of this book say it's just such a sweeping historical novel that encapsulates a certain time and place in history. And that is true, but then again, so is Dr. Zhivago, and that book is not really held in much of an esteem at all nowadays. I mean, this is often cited as kind of the book, like it's the book. If you're only going to read one book in your life, let it be this, or at least according to a lot of people. And that's just simply not true. I don't think this book is great at all. And the writing of the book, I don't know. That could have just been a translation thing. I did read the Garnet translation, which is like the most loathed translation, but I got it because it was cheap. I'm me, the tight ass. I'm going to go with the cheap version. But I refuse to believe that the translation is solely to blame for the uninspired nature of this prose, because never once was I actually awed or wowed by Tolstoy's writing in this. It's just very rote. It's just moving the story and just it's just getting across what it wants to get across, but not doing it very artfully, or so I found it. And yeah, this was just a pretty dismal experience for me. And as I said, I will never pass up an opportunity to shit on War and Peace, because it is, in my not so humble estimation, the single most overrated book in the history of books. And that is why you should not read War and Peace, because it's a waste of time, I think. But you are free to disagree. So, yeah, that was 5 classic books that I think you should not read, or that I think you will not be harmed in any way by not reading. You can feel free to disagree. I mean, if you want to be wrong, that's perfectly fine. But to each their own. But let me know down in the comments whether you have agreed or disagreed with any of these works, if you have read them. And as always, if you have enjoyed anything that you've seen or heard here today, remember to hit that like button, subscribe. I would really appreciate it. And until next time, peace.